start by just qualifying that the reason she's calling this way is because I'm a grandmother of 3. So I've earned this role. And you can't just call me by my name, there needs to be a prefix. Leadership is obviously a big discussion all over the world. But we're often exposed to political leadership and not so much to other kinds of leadership. But leadership permeates all sectors of society. It's critical in society in general, it's critical in business, it's critical in the non-for-profit sector, it's critical in politics. But when you look at South Africa, people like myself have only become part of the leadership landscape for a very short period of time. And that's really only been to the extent that we've been a democracy. So prior to 1994, you didn't come across women or black people who were in leadership positions. But when you look today, for example, the chairman of the stock exchange is a black woman and her son is sitting right here. The 2 sons, they've come to support me and listen to me. Mm-hmm. Now, to actually have a black woman chair the stock exchange of a country and an economy as big as South Africa says at one level South Africa has made strides. When you look at the boardrooms of South Africa, there is a reasonable representation of women in South Africa's boardrooms. Where we have fallen short, I think, is in the actual running of businesses and the running of industries. When you look at that picture, you see very few industries that are led by women. And this is an area where we have fallen short. And I'm not quite sure we fully understand what contributes to it. It could be a whole range of factors. One factor could be that women leave their professional lives long before they reach the executive levels, either because they make a choice to bring up their children or they decide to become entrepreneurs, as I did in my case, because I didn't really think that there were many prospects for someone like me in the early 80s, or they leave because they just don't think that there will be prospects for themselves. So the pipeline of women that are coming through the corporate sector of South Africa in the various industries is not sufficient for women to rise to the top and for us to begin to see a critical number of women who can occupy leadership positions. So that is an issue that I think we need to unpack, and this is really more your field. You do research in this area. We need to unpack and understand why are there not sufficient numbers of women who are coming through. What are the reasons? Are the constraints in the system itself? Are we limiting ourselves? Are we not believing that we deserve to run companies? Or is it just a choice that we're making? Because we make assumptions that women want to become CEOs and we measure women's achievements or success in a very narrow sense. That so if we don't see a significant number of women who are CEOs, we assume there are not sufficient numbers of women who are in leadership positions. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to broaden how we measure that and where we look, and we should look beyond just the business sector. Mm-hmm. We should look at politics, we should look in the NGO sector, and we should look at other sectors. We should look in education. I was involved, for example, in a program run by Partners for Possibility that is investing in partnering business people with school principals from disadvantaged communities to help the school principals develop their leadership capabilities. So there's a lot that's going on. There's a lot that needs to be done, would be my response to your question.
Because certainly one of the going back to the research, one of the things that is coming up is part of the problem is that there's been linking to what you're saying about focusing just on the senior levels. But one of the issues that has been coming up is that most of the research and the discourse and conversations have been around numbers and representation. And part of the problem, which has been suggested, is that we don't get to hear enough about the women's lived experiences in those senior positions. while we may want to celebrate, and we do need women entrepreneurs, but at the same time we need to be suspicious and continue to interrogate the idea that they are living by choice to go and become entrepreneurs, because at the end of the day, not all of us can be entrepreneurs. So there's that sentiment as well from the research side.
That's quite correct, but I also want to challenge how we define leadership. Leadership for me is not just a phenomenon that is visible at the top. We need to look at leadership at various levels of organization, because ultimately, what do we understand by leadership? Leadership for me is not necessarily a position. It's the impact and the influence that a person who occupies a particular role or responsibility is exercising to impact on a number of people. Mm-hmm. So I think even our understanding of what leadership means, particularly in an environment like South Africa that has so many challenges, that requires all of us to play our part in building a new nation, we should be encouraging the exercise of leadership, not just for people or by people who are in an obvious leadership role, but we should be encouraging a culture where we are all exercising our leadership capabilities, because we all have it. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't just wait until we are appointed to a senior position to exercise it. We should be exercising it wherever we are, whether you are a professor at the University of UNIS of South Africa, or whatever people are doing, whatever roles people are occupying. What would South Africa look like if we approached what we do from a leadership perspective? If we asked ourselves, what leadership can I exercise from what I'm doing and from where I am? Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying?
I hear you. And I would like to throw this back at you, because there is a suggestion that for us to understand leadership in South Africa, we also need to look back into our history. And one of the controversial propositions around that is for us to look at the fact that if you think about leadership in South Africa, there's the apartheid history with all its productivities, all its negative stuff. And then there's also the ANC in exile culture and the authority structures that informed that space. And people argue, and I support that narrative, people argue that part of the difficulties and the challenges derive from precisely the fact that South African organizations and leaders are caught up in the space between those two extremes. And the suggestion being that there's time we still need to start having conversations in that potential space. Name what is wrong or what's wrong with apartheid, but also harvest it for possible insights. By the same token, look into the ANC in exile culture and say what was good about that culture, what can we harvest from it, and what are we better off living elsewhere. I don't know if you have already thought of that.
That would not be my starting point.
Yeah.
My starting point would be to have a conversation about what is the kind of leadership that is required in South Africa.
Yeah.
Because the leadership that's required here may not necessarily be the leadership that's required in America or in France or wherever the case might be, because the circumstances are different. Then I would look at who are the people, who are the resources, what is the human capital that we have to provide that leadership. In a country and a continent where the majority of people are young people, we should be seeing a lot more young people occupying leadership positions. We should not be constraining the participation of young people in leadership positions because they don't have the experience. Because the people who are in leadership roles today at some point did not have the experience, but someone gave them an opportunity to be exposed appropriately so that their value and their contribution can be validated. And that's what we should be focusing on. We should, as a nation, be looking at even our political leaders. We should not be having people leading our politics who are older than 50. Mm-hmm. We should not be having people who are running companies who are older than 50. That for me is part of where the problem actually begins. Mm-hmm. That we have an inappropriate mix of ages. So young people who are in their 30s who are managed by someone who is in their 60s, there's already a huge generational discord. Mm-hmm. They're not going to find each other. It doesn't matter how much they try. So already you started with a deficit of misalignment that makes it difficult to build a culture where people can really tap into the diversity.
What I'm saying is that again, we need to have these spaces where we have these conversations, so that it doesn't look like all black women are like this, so we can understand where my distance might be coming from. Sometimes as a struggle, in an effort to create a good enough, or to maintain a good enough boundary at work, sometimes I find myself at least pushing back too hard, especially towards younger black women, because then that mother stuff comes up.
Yeah, but pushing too hard and being a gatekeeper are two different things.
I know.
I think she's talking about something different.
For sure.
Yeah, that should not be our role, to be gatekeepers. Especially when you are in a human resources function. Your role is to identify talent and bring the best people possible to the organization. So if a person is playing a gatekeeper role, I think they need to be challenged, because that's just inappropriate.
If it is indeed a gatekeeper role and not some supportive fantasy.
Good afternoon, thank you for your time. My name is Rebecca Suzuki. My question, I guess it's a question in comment to the initial question that was asked, is that sometimes as black females we find ourselves placed in modern times in spaces just to be the black face, just to fill in the BEE quota, or to fill in the, they take you to meetings just so that they can show that they have a black person with them, that, we are bringing up black females, but when it comes to the actual decision making, you don't get a voice. And then if you are brave enough, you leave and try and start your own thing. And then you come to a different set of challenges, which is sometimes that, similar in the line of black women, is that sometimes as black females, our black men tend to not respect us as well. And so you are in this space. I want to find out, how did you overcome that challenge as a black woman? Because there's two responses that I've experienced in a very short time. It's either it's a sexual approach or it's a fatherly role that doesn't really appreciate or value what you're bringing into the space. And how did you navigate through that? You leave the white people because they don't see you, and then you come to the white men, the black men, who either see you as a sexual potential or just as a child who's just there to be nurtured and loved, but not really respected and grown.
I don't want us to make this conversation just about women, because there are men in the conversation. So I'm going to suggest that this should be the last question that we're responding to, that's just speaking to, because that's not the topic. The topic is leadership, as it affects all of us. So I'm going to suggest that I will respond to a question, and that we should move away from the conversation that's just focusing on women, so that we can make this meaningful for everyone. So to respond to a question, I haven't had that experience. I did not, in the 80s, maybe that did not exist, because I started working in 1981, and maybe I was a minority in a corporate environment, and I worked mostly with white people, and I did not have the experience that you are describing of either sexual approaches or someone fathering me. So perhaps I was fortunate in that respect, because I worked in an environment where I was not really utilized as a black token or someone to be showed off, because that was a different era. In the 80s, that was not a requirement. That only became a requirement after South Africa became a democracy and we wanted to look at the transformation agenda, correct? So I cannot be helpful to your question, because I have not gone through that experience. And I don't like to respond to questions by making assumptions. I think that the best way to deal with what we experience is to hear from someone who's gone through a similar experience and hear how they've dealt with it. So I haven't dealt with that. I haven't been exposed to it, thankfully. I'm not quite sure how I would have dealt with it. I might have strangled someone, or I don't quite know how, because that's a violation. And I think we all respond to violations differently. I can't imagine, in as much as I have not given anyone permission in my entire working life to oppress me, I cannot imagine that I would allow or even tolerate someone who makes a sexual approach, or someone who doesn't treat me as an equal because I happen to be a black woman. So I think that it's a struggle that we have to continue to work through as women in general, not just black women, possibly black women much more, I'm not quite sure. But those are things that we should confront when they happen, because how we respond to those experiences has a lot to do with how the situation and the circumstances change for ourselves, and they change for people who come after us. And from what I know, when these situations happen, we don't confront them, we don't deal with them. As you said, the solution is to walk away. If you said, if you have the courage to go and find another job, well, the situation doesn't change. You will find it somewhere else. So I think we need to get to a place where we begin to deal with these issues that are challenging women, either from a sexual approach perspective or from not being treated as an equal. So it's issue of our responsibility to deal with it.
Okay. On that point, that helps me lead to the next set of questions. Just thinking back to when you first published Defining Moments, which was in 2002, I would like to know from you, how do you believe the South African leadership landscape has shifted in terms of both practice and discourse? And to put it differently, if you were to write a sequel to Defining Moments, what might it look like? What are some of the things that would foreground, and what are some of the things that would probably take a backseat 20 years later, or so many years later, since 2002?
What she's referring to is a book that I wrote about 15 years ago called Defining Moments. And 15 years ago, South Africa was a different country. There was a handful of black executives and black entrepreneurs, and there were very few black people who were in leadership roles. I was, for example, I'm an example of what I would call the second generation of executives that started working in the early 80s, as I said, and that became the second generation of black women to become an entrepreneur in the early 90s. But if you look today, I think that has changed. We see that there's a much larger number of black executives in virtually every industry, perhaps not to the same extent. I think that some industries have more black people, black executives, black people in leadership roles than other industries. But I wrote that book really because it was inspired by my own experience of looking for a job after I graduated in 1981, and how long it took me to get a job. I was looking for a job for a whole year with a BCom qualification. So there were a number of issues. I didn't know how to look for a job in 1981. And there wasn't a manual that I could go and look at that tells me this is how you look for a job. And secondly, once I got a job, I didn't know how to find my way through the corporate environment. And how do I actually go about developing my career? There are no instructions about how you do that. You kind of have to figure it out. So the idea of writing Defining Moments was to put in a book the experiences of black executives from the 70s, the 80s, which was my generation, and the 90s, so that younger generations and future generations can be inspired by the stories of those executives and the hardships that they had to overcome in order to build their careers in an environment that was designed for them to fail. And for us, I include myself, it's an environment that was designed for us to fail. But I also wanted that book to educate white executives about the hardships and the challenges that had shaped black executives of those three generations. Because when you understand what it takes for people to get to where they are, for a lot of people, they had to work for 2 hours to get to their workplaces at 8 o'clock and work with an executive who had a car and who only had to drive for 10 minutes to get to work. So these disparities that bring people into the workplace are not fully appreciated, and until we understand what it takes for people to go and participate in what is presumably a level play field, we won't meet each other halfway, and we will not create an environment that enables people to contribute meaningfully to their professions.
This brings me to the issue of class, because within the black community, at least I don't know about other groups, we don't talk about class. And one of the things that is coming up from research is that the first generation of black leaders and black executives came from a particular class, the privileged class. And increasingly now we're seeing children born of domestic workers and security guards ascending to leadership positions. And what I think that speaks to that, because you didn't have a manual then, but at least maybe you had professional parents who could provide some kind of a guidance. And the struggle that is coming out for some of the younger generations from poorer backgrounds, that my mother was a domestic worker. I don't have anybody to provide me guidance in the home space. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I probably wouldn't write a SIPO. I would invite younger women who are in a corporate environment to write the SIPO, because Defining Moments was based on people's real experiences. So people were sharing how they had grown up, what they had studied, what was their experience of looking for their first employment opportunity, and what was the experience that shaped them in that corporate environment. I haven't been in that environment for the last 25 years. I have no idea how it has developed and evolved. So if a SIPO was necessary, I would invite the women and the people who are sitting here to write the SIPO and share those experiences, because they need to be current experiences. And I have no sense of how the corporate landscape has changed, whether it's become an easier place to navigate or much more difficult, and what the dynamics are. Our relationship with failure, in my view, is a cultural issue. If you lived in America you will not get access to funding until you failed in at least a few enterprises. Then they believe you are now seasoned and ready to become an entrepreneur. We have the opposite view in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa. So it's a cultural thing that is reinforced at home by our parents. I remember when I was living secure employment, that was a very good job to start on my own in 1992. My parents were surprised. They just didn't understand why I would leave a secure job to go and do something that had a huge risk in their view. In my view, I felt that I had nothing to lose. I will try it. If it doesn't work, I can always go back and look for a job. And thankfully, I've never had to do that. So it needs to be part of our education system. It needs to be part of parenting, so that eventually it can change the culture that exists in our society and how we relate to failure. Because as you rightfully say, failure for me has always been an invitation for us to find out what we are capable of and to really grow as a person. It's like a muscle. Failure is like a muscle that you have to exercise, and until you've exercised that muscle, you will never really go out on a limb. You will never really go and explore the road less traveled. And part of why I've achieved what I've achieved is because I took many risks in my life. And if something didn't work out, it was okay. I just took the experience from that and I used it to do something else. So it has a lot to do with our sense of worth as people. It has a lot to do with the culture and our relationship with failure as a society. And it has a lot to do with how our parents relate to failure and how the education system relates to failure. Because even at school, if you fail, how the teacher reprimands a student who has less marks or poor marks is not very constructive, is it? So instead of the teacher really helping you and using that as an opportunity to develop a healthy relationship with failure, they actually create an adversity between yourself and failure. And maybe it's a challenge that your generation can look to change. Our generation have changed some things. We can't change everything. So we have to leave some things for your generation to sort out. And failure is definitely one of them. How do we inspire leadership transformation, I suppose, would be the question, amongst people who have different kind of experience and who probably worked much longer than we have? I've always maintained in life that it is when we can show people what value we can add to their lives that people really appreciate us. If we approach an environment to displace people. No one is going to very willingly allow themselves to be displaced. But if we approach an environment and our intention is to contribute a perspective that they didn't have before, is to contribute an understanding that they don't have, we are contributing. Life ultimately is transactional. If we are taking away, and that's part of why I think that the Black economic empowerment agenda has not worked. Because it hasn't started from a premise of expanding what's there. It started from a premise of taking from the little that's there. Well, at some point, the little that's there gets finished, and there's just not enough to go around. But if our approach to life is one of multiplication, that we will look at what we find, and we will use our perspective and understanding and knowledge and experience of the world to multiply it, to make it much bigger, then it's unlikely that people feel intimidated or they feel displaced or they feel they don't have a role, because there's a role for everybody. But if our approach is to give the impression that older people have no role to play in society, I think we will be poorer as a society. What the challenge really is, in my view, is finding a role for all of us to play so that we can step into our destiny, we can realize our potential, and we can contribute what can only be contributed by each one of us that are sitting here. What I can create with my life is very different from what she can, or you, or any one of you that are sitting here. And our challenge, and the challenge of leadership, is creating an environment that allows each one of us to bring ourselves fully to make the contribution that can only be made by us in society.
I want to link in with that and just to answer the two questions, and at the risk of repeating myself, I believe we need to be courageous enough to have difficult conversations and not to have any undiscussables, any taboos. And that means that what that requires that we create the spaces within which such conversations can take place. So if you've got because sometimes when we have these conversations, you find that we want to create women-only spaces. And there is a need for women-only spaces. But if we continue on excluding the men, I agree with you, we're going to leave half of the people that we need to collaborate with. We share these spaces. In terms of how do we authorize each other, or how do younger generations feel authorized to lead or provide leadership, again, it's about having conversation and negotiating the spaces that we work in. And that requires us, older generations, to know our limitations. Yes, to be proud of our experience, but to know where we are limited. The same though goes to the younger generations. Yes, you've got the technological expertise and other areas of expertise which you don't have. Also, you don't carry the same baggage as our generation carries. So there's a space where we take up leadership. But unless we negotiate and listen to each other respectfully, irrespective of where we're coming from, we're not going to make much progress.
Well, let me use Withhold as an example, because that's what I'm most associated with. When we created Withhold, what made Withhold successful is because women invested their own money in the creation of Withhold. So South African women raised 100 million rands of their own money. This is something that was unprecedented. And that's what changed how the market responded to Withhold. So we have to be willing to do something completely different that's going to disrupt how people have always assumed things work, to really get the momentum that you require. Secondly, you need to surround yourself with people who can add value to what you are wanting to create. So the lesson, for example, from creating Withhold, we created Withhold as women. And the lesson is that if we were to do Withhold again, we would definitely not exclude men. If we had created Withhold with men, we probably would have grown twice as much as what we've achieved. Withhold is currently worth about 5 billion rands today. It probably would have been worth 50 billion. Because the reality, to go back to the question that you were asking earlier about how do we inspire people who have experience and leadership that is of a seniority level to us? How do we inspire them to learn from us? The reality is that men in any society have greater access to resources, have greater networks than women have. And so we have to be strategic. And that's what, that for me is the greatest lesson, that if I had to do it again, I would be more strategic. I would build alliances with people who would enable us to get to our destination much faster than it took us to get there. And the third thing that I would do, I would create a model that mixes generations. We made an attempt to do that, but not sufficiently. We had 3 different generations of women who were involved in the starting of WIPO, but I think it could have been much broader, because then you get to tap into each generation that you want to impact, because unless a generation is represented in what you're trying to create, you will not be able to impact those generations. And finally, I think we have to create initiatives and solutions that are going to leave behind a legacy. So people in 20 years and 50 years will look at WIPO and they will be able to see the legacy that WIPO was able to create with respect to the participation of women in the South African economy. And it has now become a case study for the world, because what we were able to achieve here has not been done anywhere else in the world.